second. I just want to make sure that we're recording this. There we go. That each of you is going to have your own way of solving problems, but it's about how you articulate that. And you'll definitely have that as one of the requests. So the next skill is something called critical thinking and analysis skills. Critical thinking and analysis skills is probably one of the most challenging things to talk about. So I kind of want to open it up to everyone. What do you guys think of when you hear the term critical thinking? And feel free to unmute yourself and kind of jump in. But what do you guys think of when you hear the term critical thinking? What does that actually mean? How would you define that?
Okay, can I go?
Yeah, go ahead, Zena.
Yeah, it's thinking outside the box.
Thinking outside the box, that's great.
Yeah.
What's another definition for people?
I think like creating a solution to a complex problem, like being able to go through the steps.
Great. Say that one more time, Jeremy. That was actually really
Could you hear me? So like being able to think of or create an answer to a complex problem and being able to go through the steps of it.
Totally. So just to reiterate what Jeremy was saying, is about going through and finding solutions to a complex problem, but also being able to go through that step by step, which I think is great. Anyone else have anything related to critical thinking?
Actually, I had a conversation with my brother about like discussing what critical thinking is versus like just memorizing.
Great.
It's like just memorizing data is like, it's very like linear. You just take in information. Whereas critical thinking, you need to be able to organize data into different priorities and find the differences in between two data and connections. So it's like organization.
Awesome. So the organization of really defining, especially when kind of what Hea was saying about looking at two different sets of data, and then from there actually starting to compare those and utilizing that set of data to compare, I think is really great as well. Anyone else have a version of critical thinking or analysis skill?
Yeah, I think like applying and understanding to reach a solution.
Awesome. Say that one more time, Austin, for me.
Sure. Applying and understanding to reach a solution.
Awesome. Cool. So that's really great as well, especially the application side of it, because I think that critical thinking, oftentimes people get stuck in there's no action from the critical thinking. But what I've noticed that everyone has really talked about is that it starts as a thought or a concept in our brain, leads into the processing of information, and then ultimately leads to taking action. And so that's something definitely around critical thinking and analysis skills that's really important for a developer, because sometimes it can be easy to be that idea generator. Sometimes it can be easy to take someone's idea and start to try to like work it out. And then for other people, the implementation side is more the easier thing. For a developer, eventually you're expected to be able to do all three of those things. And that's not necessarily something that you need to have fully developed in order to be a developer, but is something that you will continually work about. So these definitions of critical thinking are all really, really great. I also just want to reiterate, if I ask you to repeat something, it's not necessarily because we can't hear you or something. This goes back to one of the expectations that was set about being a little bit more patient and a slower pace. So sometimes I think repeating stuff. So if I ask you to repeat, it's more just to help that process. I just kind of wanted to say that out loud so that people didn't think that they weren't being heard or something like that. We can hear you pretty clearly. It's just making sure that that idea keeps getting regenerated.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So around critical thinking and analysis skills, this is one of the most challenging questions to get during an interview, for example. And I would even say that employers actually struggle the most with trying to create a question around this. So my recommendation for how to prepare yourself to talk about critical thinking and analysis skills is exactly what everyone just did. It's really about having a definition of what you think critical thinking is, and then talking about how you then go through the process of analyzing that problem that you're working through. So that's kind of the process there. And then the last skill that we're going to cover is, I think, let's see if my memory serves me correctly. Andy, I think you were the one who said it when I was like, what's the #1 skill when I was trying to get you all to say problem solving? I think Andy said communication, and that is in fact the last skill. Communication and collaboration skills are the most important to develop. Now, what's an interesting statistic around communication is that across every single industry, when you ask managers, supervisors of companies, and there's a lot of research studies out there that are across different industries where they're interviewing, 125 different companies, those types of things. When they say, what's the #1 in-demand skill set of any professional? Everybody says communication. And then on the flip side, when they ask a different research study that says, what is the one skill set that you feel like your employees lack the most? Guess what it is? Communication. um, so it's an interesting kind of like duality between the need for strong communication and collaboration skills and whether or not those actually show up. And I think it's often because people don't actually know what they're talking about, interestingly enough, when they're talking about communication. So for me, the communication skills section that's really important to identify for yourself is the following question. So I'm going to ask you guys to take about 3.5 minutes to kind of jot down some ideas for yourself about answering this question. What type of communicator are you? So again, I'm going to repeat the question. What type of communicator are you? I know this seems like a very generic question, and the reason that I keep it generic is because I will tell you that every employer will want to know what type of communicator you are, and most of them don't know how to ask the question specifically. So really thinking through what type of communicator are you? If you remember from yesterday when we looked at the transferable skills section that's all about communication, there's things like written communication, verbal communication, nonverbal communication, conflict resolution, all of those types of things as well. So there's a lot of things that go into how we actually look at communication. So I want you to answer that question for yourself. What type of communicator are you? And I'm gonna give you guys 3.5 minutes starting now. Okay, we're gonna come back in about 1 minute, maybe closer to like 55 seconds. All right. So, who would like to share what type of communicator they are?
May I go?
Yep, you're good, Austin. Go ahead.
Cool. I put polite and forward, and what I mean by that is I try not to be rude, but I will ask what I'm looking for as directly as possible.
That's great. So, talking a little bit more, Austin, tell me a little bit more about if you were to have to sum that up into a single statement of what type of communicator you are, how would you say that?
Well, I put polite and forward before, but you're looking for a different word?
Yeah, so what I'm hearing, which is great, is like you're a really direct like a direct compassionate communicator, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Is what I'm hearing
Okay.
from
Yeah.
you is that like I still like to be really direct and get to the heart of it, but what's really important for me is that we are able to kind of I want to do it compassionately, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's
Does that answer your own question?
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Who else wants to share?
Me.
All right, go ahead, Mail.
Okay, so I really want to be a good communicator, like nonverbal, as well as just being in person and such like that. But personally, I think I'm best at written communication because I have time to really think through, prepare, and organize my thoughts so that I can put out a more detailed and structured like message to relay to them.
That's great. That's awesome. I like the conversation or the ability to talk about both verbal and nonverbal. I think that's an important thing to be able to talk about and kind of how to balance those. That's really great. Andy, I see that you're unmuted. Do you want to go?
Sure thing. I apologize. My wife is also having to work from home, so if you guys hear any background noise, I apologize there. But she's right next to me. But with that, I'm kind of in the same boat there with Austin, where I'm active. I'd kind of put it more like aggressive but active listener as well with it, where I am aggressive in the sense I'm making the eye contact. I'm there. I want to actually get directly to what I'm trying to ask, but at the same time, trying to be polite about it. Making sure that I'm understanding the other person needs time to understand what I'm telling them, process it, and also, being a little bit more passive sometimes with it as well, if that makes any sense.
That does make sense. I think the one thing that I will share with you, Andy, is to be very careful of the word aggressive. It's so spot on. I know exactly what you mean, but the term aggressive, especially in a job interview setting, they'll be like, huh? Like I like to say that I'm from Massachusetts. If you guys have ever heard the term masshole, it's a real term. And I, especially like with driving, and I always say, I was like, we're aggressively defensive drivers. So like I'm super aggressive of looking ahead, and if someone's making a mistake up there, I'll cut you off so that I'm not screwed later on. But yeah, but that term aggressive kind of can sometimes have a different meaning for a lot of people. But I like the idea of where you're going with that. It made a lot of sense to me. So it's just about finding that like other word that can be used besides aggressive.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to share?
I can go.
Go ahead, Shocker.
Cool. So I feel like a lot of times I don't really know what to say. So I feel that I'm more of a listen and ask questions type of communicator. So I feel like what I try to do is allow the other person to speak and mindfully listen to what they have to say and then find some sort of question to ask them based on what they said. And usually that tends to move into a whole like topic or another set of questions that you can ask. And I feel like that's how that's what I use to kind of keep the conversation going. It's just to ask questions and to like just really try to pay attention to what the other person's saying. That's
awesome. A cool term you can use, Shocker, that something I heard out of that is like a very reflective communicator. I'm that way too, especially like in big meeting settings. I tend to like sit back and just listen before I ask questions or participate, because I find that I process the information easiest versus because I'm that type of person who likes to have as much information as possible. So I think that's great. And that's kind of like another way of phrasing that as like a very reflective communicator, which I think is good as well.
Cool. I like it.
Awesome. Cool. So again, it's about part of what you've seen me do a little bit too with some of the examples is also taking some of the examples and trying to just like, we're going to, a lot about what today is going to be about is talking about language and how important language is when we're doing things like resume, when we're doing things like job interviews and stuff like that. The language that we're using is really important because the more specific your language can be, the easier it is to help combat against assumptions that people can make. And I think that that's probably the most challenging thing in a job search is we only have like this much language that we actually get to use to try to get a job. It always like perplexes me that a company is willing to invest like thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars into a single employee that they only spend 3 hours with to figure out if they're going to be the employee, right? And so a lot of times it comes down to the language that we're using to help get us to that position, because it's all about gaining trust. Ultimately, the reason people are hired are less about like their direct skills. The skills are obviously definitely important, but it's also about building trust with a future employer so that they feel that, great, they've shared these skills and we trust them that they actually have these skills and can implement them, right? So that's kind of like a big thing that's really important moving forward there. So the next thing that we're going to jump to is something that is called an accomplishment statement. And so this will actually help with resume writing later today. And then after this, we're going to jump back into the tech outlook conversation that we were going to have yesterday. And so has anyone ever heard of an accomplishment statement? Give me like a thumbs up or hand raise if you've heard of an accomplishment statement. Okay, cool. So an accomplishment statement, I will tell you, I'm actually not a huge fan of the phrasing accomplishment statement because it makes it sound like, I don't know, you have to like have done something amazing in order to put it on your resume. So I like to treat them, or I talk about accomplishment statements as contribution statements. So when you guys are creating your resumes in particular, and this will tie back into some of these transferable skills, you guys have heard that on a resume, anything that is a bullet point under a job experience should start very actively with an active verb of some kind. And if it is a previous job, that's something that is done in past tense, and that if it's something that's currently happening, then it is done in present tense. But the big thing is making sure that you have the ability to share what you have contributed to the company. So where accomplishment statements come from is when companies are looking at your resume. Resumes used to kind of function the same way as like a job description functions, which is, here are the key responsibilities or requirements that I have of my job. And the challenge with that is that it doesn't really tell us a lot about what you did for the organization. Were you successful at the organization in meeting these requirements? All of that kind of stuff as well. So to flip that on its head, that's when accomplishment statements really started to become the norm for resume writing. And the formula for an accomplishment statement or a contribution statement is actually pretty simple. So basically it kind of looks something like this, where it starts with some sort of action. And then in your resources, so in your Google Drive, if you open this PowerPoint presentation, this is going to bring you to a resource that has, I don't know, it's like 10 pages or so of action verbs. But what's great is I've taken all the action verbs and I have separated them by like those types of transferable skills that you're trying to talk about, which is kind of nice as well. So you start with some sort of action. So in this example, it is the word initiate. You then share a relevant topic that is relevant to the job that you are actually applying for, or relevant to something that you did for that company. Then you talk a little bit about the impact that that action had. And then there are some additional things called key metric and benefit, which are very helpful. And basically, you'll notice at the bottom that like the benefit is is quantified, so it's an actual number. Not every single contribution statement that you have is necessarily going to be an actual number. But really what you're looking to showcase is how and what you've contributed to that company in the past. So for example, this example says, initiated a new product launch process that reduced time to market by 75%. So when we're constructing our resumes and we have our work experience and then we have all the bullet points after, this is typically what I recommend when you're kind of pushing forward with that. The first thing is I actually like, I have a few examples to show you guys as well, but there are some of our students have taken on this new version of writing a resume, which is there's the job, there's the company, the job that you held at that company, the time frame that you were there at that company, and then below that is a single sentence that basically says like, this is overall like what this position did. And then under that are bullet points that are more accomplishment and or contribution statement related, which follow this kind of process, which is more of like the action verb, and then kind of talking from there as well. Let me see. I have someone just raised their hand. Give me 1 second.
That was me.
Awesome. Go for it.
Yeah, that example, that what you were just describing, do you have a picture of that at all, or will you put together some example for us?
Yeah. Are you guys seeing the PowerPoint shared screen? Yeah.
We are, yeah.
Yeah. So, but so I do have an example of what I was just talking about. Is
cool.
that like sentence and then going from there as well?
Yeah. I do have another question. I kind of like, I forgot how you worded it, so I didn't like write it down. So by going over each of the highlighted text, the relevant topic, and then the key metric, what were the words you used to describe that again?
So the key metric is really, to me, when you're creating an accomplishment statement, the action and the relevant topic, those are kind of like the what I did. And then the impact to key metric and benefit is really what you contributed or what you actually accomplished through that action and relevant topic is kind of how to think about it. So for this instance, from a job posting, for example, you would be looking for something that kind of, this would be for something like a new product manager. Part of those job descriptions tend to say like, we need someone to come in and help launch our product process, or you'll be a part of that product process. So from a previous example, or for a previous work experience, this allows for us to then share that, at this previous company, I actually have experience initiating a new product launch process. And for this company, I reduced the time to market by 75%. That is really exciting to a potential hiring manager, because they are then able to see that this may be a potential benefit for them as well. So part of where the accomplishment statement and contribution statements come from, like why they're important to utilize versus just listing like, here were my core responsibilities for this job, is that a company is more interested in what value are you going to bring to that company. And this is probably the most challenging like mindset shift when you go onto a job search. Is oftentimes people think like, I just have to showcase my skills and I have to like basically sound like I'm amazing and awesome, which is why I tend to move away from the term accomplishment statement and more try to use that contribution statement, because really the people who are most successful in a job search process and tend to get the job more are those who are able to share past experiences that allow for an employer to start to visualize that person in that position. And so we'll talk a little bit about that more tomorrow with like preparing for job interviews and stuff like that. But it really does start with your job materials in your resume by sharing kind of, this is how I contributed to the company. So let me grab, give me 1 second. I'm gonna grab, I have kind of a couple of examples on my own resume so you can kind of see some additional. Can you guys all see my resume right now? Or are you guys still seeing the PowerPoint? Good, okay.
We see it.
Great. So very briefly kind of looking through some of this stuff, we'll look at kind of my time here at Learn Academy. So for me, obviously all of these are contribution statements are starting with an action or an action verb. And again, some of them are in past tense because it's stuff that I developed versus stuff that I'm currently working on. So when you're currently at a job or something like that, that is where kind of the tense can be a little bit different depending on what it is that you're doing, but every previous job should be in past tense.
Okay.
So we can kind of see here, one of the big things that I've contributed to Learn, for example, is build and foster business relationships within the local and international tech industry to support the internship program. So that for me is like, that's part of my job responsibilities. And what I contributed is that I increased our business partners by 30% within 6 months. So for that, a company can be like, oh, wow, so he really does have experience doing business development and has a good track record of increasing overall business, B2B business partnerships by about 30%. So this is kind of showcasing some of that key metric and benefit. So the benefit that I really am doing for Learn is by increasing their business partners by 30% within 6 months. If we're looking at previous experience as well, you can see that sometimes things are not quantifiable, right? So for me, I developed a new employee first year experience program, including a half-day onboarding program and roundtable session. So for this example, there isn't necessarily something that's quantifiable, but it does show a deliverable that I gave to the company, and it's a specific deliverable versus just saying like, I was in charge of creating new programming for the HR department. So that's kind of the shift. You want to get away from more of that generic stuff and really try to focus in on some of this more like contribution statement. One of my favorites examples that I have for you is actually Rachel's resume. So you guys will see Rachel came to Learn from a background in retail. And so what was great about Rachel's resume, she did a really good job of figuring out how she could take her retail experience and turn it into contribution statements. Retail, restauranting, those types of previous professions all have a lot of similarities. So her examples are really, really great to see how to create those contribution statements, if that makes sense. Rachel's saying this may be an old example. It is an old example. It's one of your original resumes, but it still is very helpful. Okay, does that kind of answer your question, Austin?
Yeah, it does. And how I kind of wrote it down was almost like 3 parts. Because going off of your example, I kind of changed what I wrote down a bit. Like starting with some action verb, then what you added to the company, and then kind of in a block, it's like one of these things or all of these are just kind of summed up, like the impact that had, like in the company, the outcome, and just like the benefit, just like one of those 3 or all of them, are just any positive thing that came out of that, really. Right?
Exactly. So Austin actually summed that up really, really well, is that the impact, key metric, and benefit Ideally, if you can have all three, that's like the best contribution statement that you can create. But if you only really have like an impact, typically you'll have like an impact and a key metric, or maybe a key metric and a benefit. But that's exactly right, that you're able to kind of create this, here's the positive impact that I had on this company through this position, rather than going from the context of like, here's what I did in this position, if that makes sense, which then will read more like a job description. I had an example of, so I worked in an HR department for the last 3.5 years prior to coming to Learn, where we did a lot of recruitment and stuff like that. And my least favorite that happened, and granted we were in the public sector and things work a little bit differently in the public sector when you're applying for a job, but we had an internal candidate who literally took the job description and copy and pasted the job description and put it into their resume under a previous position and said, I've done all these things, because they knew that they needed to check all the boxes, right? And they ended up having like a resume that was, I think it was like almost 11 pages long, because they did that. But in their mind, they were like, well, I'm meeting all the benchmarks and they can't say that I'm not qualified because I just said that I'm qualified. My argument against that resume was like, well, we don't actually know what they did. Especially like in an admin type position, when someone's like, oh, I file paperwork, and I go, I would expect for you to file paperwork as an admin. But if you're an admin and you said, increased efficiency in filing process by creating a new labeling system or something like that, that to me shows innovation, that you were thinking through of how to problem solve, right? So if you think about it that way too, especially for tech companies, when they look at your previous experience, they want to see those types of skills that we talked about before, which is like, how did you solve problems in your previous position? How did you critically think in your previous position? And then how did you communicate and work on a team? Because those, again, are the three big ones that everybody looks for. So that's kind of another way to think about contribution statements as well. Are there any other questions about contribution statements or accomplishment statements?
So these are the statements under usually under like the first line, like Learn Academy. But how many do you recommend? Like,
great.
Minimum?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we'll actually, my example is actually pretty good for anything that's current or is relevant to the jobs that you are looking for. So many of you may have previous experience that it was actually more technical, or you may have done technical things in previous positions, because my favorite, especially hearing some of your guys' stories yesterday, is that oftentimes we're doing a role that has nothing to do with technology, but because we're technologically savvy, we're the ones who have to do all the technology for everyone else. So sometimes it's really great. Those are some great bullet points to put under as well. But I would say for something that is current, you should aim for anywhere between 4 and 5 bullet points as a maximum. And then from a minimum standpoint, I would always make sure that if you're going to put an experience on your resume, it should have at least a minimum of 2 bullet points, if that makes sense. And then as you get further and further away, and I'll talk a little bit about this during the resume workshop as well, is it's really important to think through the following, is that if it is a position that is like really not related at all, those are the ones that you can have a small minimum number of bullet points. And sometimes I may even recommend and break my rule and say, this is a great position to have in for this, that, or the other reason, but we really only need a single bullet point for this position because it's not as related to what you're applying to. But for the most point, I would say a maximum of 4 to 5, and then a minimum of 2 for most of those experiences. Cool. Any other questions about contribution statements?
I have another one.
Yeah,
before you were saying like you want to share a vision of how you contributed to a company. Like, let's say you haven't, any jobs you've been in, you haven't contributed anything because you're just an employee, they didn't really listen to you, blah, blah, blah. Would you rather, would it be like, yeah, you don't have anything you have not contributed anything. So would it be better to try to say your accomplishments and kind of phrase it in a way to show them how you could contribute to the company?
Great question, Austin. So what I would recommend is when you feel like you've worked for a company and you feel as if maybe you didn't contribute as much as you could have, or you don't have specific examples, I always say before doing what you're suggesting, Austin, is to go this path instead. Talk about the skill sets that you feel like you developed while you were there. So for example, if you feel like you were in this, like maybe a customer service position, and constantly were dealing with new customers, and having to like really work through communication skills, you can put a bullet point that says strengthened my communication skills through constant customer interaction, and helping to provide the best service that I could. Something along those lines helps to format and be like, I really built communication skills. So as opposed to the contribution statement towards the company, I always say if you don't have those contributions to the company or feel like you don't have enough for the bullet points, some of your other bullet points can be, these are some of the skills that I gained while I was here or strengthened while I was here. So that helps to showcase like, in this job, I helped to build the following skills, if that makes sense. Rather than saying like customer service rep who took phone calls like on a daily basis or something like that. I would rather hear like increase or strengthened my communication skills by interacting with customers on a daily basis, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. Any other questions? Cool. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump into talking about the tech industry. Woohoo! This would be a good time to get up and stretch your bones for 5 to 10 to 20 seconds. Feel free to have an individual dance party if you would like. If you don't want anyone to see your dance moves, you can turn off your camera temporarily. But we're gonna now start talking a little bit more about the tech industry now and in the future. All right. So the big thing that I like to say at the top of this conversation is you all have definitely chosen the right industry. If you qualify under the following, and this is kind of the challenging thing for a lot of people. So the tech industry is definitely an industry that you will continue to learn and grow in every single day. Even if you talk to every single senior dev that you meet, they will say, I think Rob said it yesterday when he was talking to all of you, that like, I think he laughed at Chelsea when he was like, it's just funny that we're talking about like continual learning as we're learning to be developers. He's like, as if like when you become a developer you don't learn anymore, because as a developer you'll learn something brand new every single day. And so part of that commitment to the tech industry is really kind of that love for continuous improvement. And the nice thing is that matches very well with where the tech industry is going. The tech industry is very innovative. It's constantly adapting and those types of things as well. And that the industry expects the same thing of its members of industry, which I think is really great. The other cool thing is we're also starting to see trends like that in the HR department. So if anyone has experience working with HR folks before or not, I think the interesting thing is that in the tech industry, the HR functionality talent acquisition teams are starting to put in more new innovative practices rather than say like the finance industry and all these other things. So my favorite is like, if anyone's ever heard the term like, don't be a Karen from HR. I'm happy none of you are named Karen. But there's always like that, like, oh, like she's like the Debbie Downer and she comes in and she ruins all of our fun and blah, 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 blah. Those people almost don't exist in the tech industry because just like developers and software engineers, it is encouraged that everyone in the tech industry is willing to continue to innovate, adapt, and continue to change, which is a great place to be. So with the tech industry, Some of the studies that I'm going to share are data. So the study is from 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. So I have 4 different studies that I'm going to talk about in relation to the tech industry, to talk about job growth, stuff like that. And it's typically, I always like to explain data as much as possible. It's typically because most of these types of studies take a 5-year period, and then it typically takes 1 to 2 years after that 5-year period in order to actually get the data out there. So if you've ever done research or worked with data before, that tends to be a similar trend. So that's why when you're seeing like the 2019 study, it's really talking about the 2018 tech industry. And so now that we're in 2020, you'll even see on this slide, companies will spend $191 billion on cloud computing services by 2020. So even this study starts to look a little outdated because, again, of where it was. But I think it's helpful for you all to see how the industry has grown since Learn was founded back in 2015. So starting in 2015, there were 6.7 million tech industry workers. The tech industry made up about 7.1% of the US GDP. And there were about 1 million jobs added to the tech industry between the years 2010 and 2015. And that really kind of started this bigger tech boom that was happening in the earlier 2010s. We're now 10 years past that original date of 2010, and the nice thing is that we're continuing to see the tech industry grow. This is the study from 2017, and you'll notice that if we go back to the, we go back to the previous. So there were 6.7 million tech industry jobs by 2016, so the start of 2016. By the start of 2017, there was 11.5 million tech jobs in the United States. So there was a vast jump that happened around the 2015 to 2017 job market. Part of the reason that boot camps actually were created was because there became this new need for talent in the tech industry, but there weren't enough people getting trained to be developers. And that's really where the boot camp model kind of stemmed from, and which is why you saw a lot of boot camps start to form back in 2015. If you look at our employment numbers in 2015, it's the best year that we've ever had. And it's because the demand was so high back in 2015 that a lot of our students were picked up literally within a week of graduating because there was such a deficit in the talent pools. And so we'll talk a little bit about where that deficit lies now, because there still is a deficit. It just has shifted and changed slightly. So over that past year, 194,000 new jobs were added. And then the number of software and web developers in the United States increased to 1.4 million software developers and web developers, which is the largest and fastest growing category of tech jobs. So this was at the top of 2017. Now, the last number, which I think is really interesting, is that the number of postings for tech occupation jobs during 2017 was 2.8 million, but there were only roughly about 1.4 million that were being formed. So what they started to see is that although there were all of these job postings that were happening, there was such a talent deficit starting in 2017 that those really just weren't being filled. Starting in 2015, and those just weren't really being filled for several years. And so what's nice is we've seen the tech industry start to take this very innovative approach of how they bring on new employees. And also kind of where they're starting. So we'll talk a little bit about those trends moving forward. The other interesting thing that I always like to point out with our tech industry is that the unemployment rate. So this goes back to that 2016 study with the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. You can see the trend from 2008 to 2016 is that even when the unemployment rate nationally across all industries was at its peak back in 2009, 2010, if you were a fellow college graduate between 2009 and 2010 with me, you know how bad that job market was. So Woohoo! But as you can see, the national unemployment rate has always been higher than the technology industry unemployment rate, and that continues to show this trend even moving forward. So even though, back in 2016, I think the unemployment rate in the United States right now is closer to like 3.75%, and maybe, I'm sure right now it might be slightly higher. With everything going on. But as of right now, the tech industry unemployment rate is 1.7%. So the nice thing is that we're actually seeing a similar decrease in that unemployment rate as the national unemployment rate decreases as well. So this helps to showcase the safety net, in a way, of being in the tech industry, is because the unemployment rate is always much lower than the national unemployment rate. So it is definitely a safer industry to be a part of. And then this is job postings versus active candidates. So this goes back to that that number of about this is almost about 2.2 million job postings, and there were only about 300, we'll round up just in case, around 320,000 active candidates. So there was a giant deficit during that 2015-2016, which again is where a lot of these boot camps started to come from. Now, the other interesting thing, this is a study that was done by HackerRank back in 2018, their tech recruiting report. It's a really great report. You can go on to HackerRank and actually download this recruiting report. Their 2019 numbers should actually be coming out in the next month or so, which will be very helpful as well. But one of the interesting things that we saw in 2018 as well is this question of, have you hired a great candidate who was highly qualified but didn't have a strong resume, i.e. a traditional education? So what this meant, which I thought was an interesting way of phrasing this question, but really what they were looking for is, did you hire someone that was a non-traditional route? And so what we saw in 2018 is that the 75% of companies that took this survey said yes, that they have hired someone that was highly qualified but didn't have that traditional education moving into the tech industry. And we'll see that there was a much larger percentage that was no, at 16%. And then obviously, just like every study, there's a bunch of people who don't know anything, so they say don't know. No, I'm just kidding. But what was very interesting from a study like this, and what we are actually starting to see, is that there is an increased trend of hiring boot campers more today than there was even back in 2015 when there was the large deficit. Part of the reasoning behind this, and again, this is a little bit conjecture on my part, so or my interpretation of the data, is there's a lot of data around product development that once a product reaches its 5-year marker, that is really when people start to trust that product, and whether that product is like a physical product or product as a service. So if you think about back in 2015 was really when most boot camps started to come on the market. And unfortunately, it took those 5 years to really showcase that the boot camp model for training people to be software engineers and web developers actually works. And so now that we're at 2020, there has been a giant increase in the amount of companies that are willing to, we'll say, take a chance on a boot camp grad by hiring them. And that's a trend that we've seen here in San Diego, but also we've started to see nationally as well. And I like to think about it as that service. So as a boot camp product starts to, like, over and over again, there are more successes coming out of boot camps that are being successful employees and those types of things. Companies are now starting to realize that that is a really actual, like, benefit to hiring someone, because they come in with not just the traditional education training, but they are also coming in with all of this other skill sets from previous employers, which is also really great. So in a 2019 study, when asked if they have hired a boot camper, and just so that we know how high the numbers jumped from a year, In the same study back in 2018, only 7% of companies said that they were willing to hire a boot camper. For 2019, the same study showed an uptick of about that 13% of companies were willing to hire a boot camper. Now, I know that number still feels small, but it's important to think about what that data means, that in just a single year, that percentage doubled in people that are more willing. So if we continue to see that doubling trend, we're going to continue to see an even higher rate of direct hire and quick hires from the bootcamp model, which is really awesome. Big things that people are seeing from the bootcamp model that they're not getting from traditional like CS degree holders is actual hands-on experience and the understanding of skill sets. Because a lot of traditional CS programs, although they're starting to morph and change, a lot of them spend a lot of time on theory and not as much time on practical, actual coding experience. And so that's where a lot of—
I could vouch for that. I went to college for a little bit.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, we've actually had a few, Jeremy, I'd be interested in your perspective on that too, but we've definitely had some students who have come through that have CS degrees that are like, well, I'm coming to the boot camp because I feel like I didn't get the hands-on experience that I needed during my 4 years as a part of that program. And each program is slightly different, so it's not necessarily fair to generalize, but the majority of 4-year degree programs are going to spend more time on the theory of computer science and development work and less on the hands-on practical experience of like coding, especially with these more modern languages like JavaScript. All right, you guys ready to talk about earning potential? We can see back in this 2016 study where the average tech salaries were. So for a web developer, the average tech salary across the country was about $85,000 a year. That has probably increased to just under $100,000. So it's roughly about $96,000 a year right now across the country. Now, the interesting thing about this visual is that we can also see that back in 2016, data engineers were few and far between, data scientists were few and far between. We're also starting to see there's another really great DICE put out a recent report. I think I actually saw someone share that report of like the state of the software engineer for 2020, looking back at 2019 data. And what was interesting about that is that it does also show that as new technologies are coming onto the market, we're starting to see that those jobs are being paid the most because no one is skilled in them. So that was actually very similar back in 2016, 2017. The reason that these two positions are much higher of the average tech salary is because there were not a lot of people that existed here. So in order to attract people to those positions, that was really the best way to do that is to hike the salary. Now, the other important thing to know about these average tech salaries is like for this web developer, it includes both junior entry level, mid-level, and senior level salaries. So these numbers are really the average of all of the salaries of a web developer as opposed to breaking it down from junior, mid-level, and senior. So that's what this average base pay is below here. This is the number from the beginning of 2019. This has slightly increased for San Diego, but this is the actual average base paid salary for San Diego County for an entry-level web developer. And you can see here on the side, junior developer and all those kinds of things, you can kind of see that a lot of these are higher than this average base pay. So what I like to tell our students is the expected salary that you can expect coming out of our boot camp directly is anywhere from $45,000 a year to $65,000 a year. I know that it's a pretty big range, but that's pretty average. The pretty average range for a junior or entry-level web developer at a small to mid-level size company. Now, when you start to get into the much larger companies, say like a ServiceNow, a Qualcomm, IBM, those types of companies, that salary is going to jump because they have the resources available. So this average base pay is definitely that 45 to 65 range is definitely more in lines with a small to mid-level startup. so to consider that as well. Lots of our alumni have been over that salary range as well. And so that's actually something that we are in the process of getting from the past year, and something we'll be able to share with you probably in the next few weeks, of all of our 2019 grads, of where they were at from a salary standpoint. And so what's great about that is we're able to kind of see that that's the average base pay. And most of our students are seeing an increase in pay within the first year of anywhere from an additional 10 to an additional $30,000, depending on if that's a promotion within a company or a shift to a brand new position. And you can also see here this range that says $44,000 to $98,000. So the salary really does range, because this is trying to take into consideration the small companies as well as the large companies. Does anyone have any questions about the salaries in particular? Okay. So,
Wait, Brian.
yeah, go for it, Danny.
Sorry, I have a question. So I remember during the panel that we had, one of the panelists mentioned like negotiating your salary.
Yeah.
Is that something you would recommend for like whenever we get our first one, just like countering an offer?
Yeah. So,
and if so, how to do it effectively?
Yeah, so Rob's going to talk to you guys about that a little bit more in depth on Friday.
Okay.
Yes, I highly recommend making sure that that happens. Okay, what I have to do really quickly is I did not take a bio break when we were on break, because I was trying to figure out some tech stuff. So I need to take a quick bio break. So we're going to take a 5-minute, and I'll be right back. We're not going to change to a different channel, but we'll return in just 5 minutes. So I'll see you guys in just a second. All right, everybody. So we're going to come back in 1 minute. Austin, I saw that you raised your hand. Is there a question I can kind of start to think through while we're waiting for everyone to return?
Yeah. First, I'll ask you the second one afterward because it's just by going back to the other slide. But the other one I have is I don't know if I'm wording this right, but like I'm looking at all the tech salaries here, and there's all different titles. And I was wondering about like what are some examples of some students who I would assume typically their title would be web developer coming out of this, but what are some other titles that people have held might be similar, or people who just have not taken that route? Just kind of wondering what those numbers are.
Yeah, so we will actually talk about all of the different job titles in 2 more slides, but
Okay.
there's a lot of different positions. I would say that roughly about 75% of people who graduate our program are in a developer or software engineer role.
Okay.
And oftentimes software engineer and web developer are interchangeable of like what their responsibilities are. So you'll even see on this slide where it says software engineer in that like neon green color is slightly higher than a web developer, but oftentimes companies treat those as exactly the same.
Okay. Thank you.
And then I would say that another like 10% of our folks are doing maybe some like technical support, QA engineering, so a little bit less on the development side and more on the like supportive tech roles to web developers, software engineers, especially when they first get out. So I would say that that's closer to about 10%. And then there's another probably 10 to 15% that are doing additional technical roles that would include something like a product manager, a project manager, a business analyst type position, and those types of positions that are more on like the business side of being in the tech field is about roughly 10 to 15% of our alumni are kind of in that category, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Then the other one, if you still want to take a minute, I could just ask later.
No, you can go ahead now. Yep.
Okay, sure. The slide before this, what was the title on that one? This one says earning potential. What was the one before that?
It says there was no title. So this is just
okay.
a reflection on this was the original hacker rank that kind of has started to show the trend of moving away from traditional education and now more into looking at alternative ways to get into the tech industry from like a hiring.
Yeah, sorry, did I interrupt you?
Nope, you're good.
Oh, okay. So I'm kind of thinking, you said it takes about 5 years to prove a model works. Is that what you said?
Yep. So most boot camp started back in 2015. So we're at that 5-year mark, and we're seeing a steeper increase in people that are hiring boot camp grads recently.
Okay. And when you said 5 years to prove a model works, are you specifically talking about like education for this kind of career path? People to kind of trust it?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was referring to there. And again, it's important to know that this is like my interpretation of the data and conjecture on where we're at. There's not a study that says, based off of this, like the boot camp trend has like increased because of this. But there are research studies out there that do show that it takes roughly about 5 years for a product to build enough trust that it can be successful on its own, if that makes sense. Without having to like convince people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so a lot of our previous alumni, for example, when they first graduated, they had to really explain what a boot camp was. A lot of people didn't know what it was, and then there was this weird like, yeah, but did you actually learn? Like a lot of people didn't know what the curriculums were like for boot camp, stuff like that. But now that it's been on the market for so long, which is a great thing, we've started to see a better trend moving forward of hiring. And we've always had a pretty good, like our hiring rate, just so that you guys know, right now of all of our alumni, which we have 350, about 89% of them are hired in the tech industry. There's another and then we have 91% of our alumni are fully employed at this point. The other 9% that's unaccounted for includes people that are what I call drop-offs, which means that they drop off in communication with us, even though we've reached out to them for over a year. And so there is kind of that category as well. We just don't know if they are in a tech job or not in a tech job, even through follow-up and stuff like that. So that's kind of that 9% that's unaccounted for. From all of our grads. So, so from a hiring standpoint or an employment rate, 91% is a really, really great employment rate for over our 5 years of existence. And then again, about 89% of those are in direct tech related positions.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Cool. So, again, the important thing, I also want to kind of revisit Danny's question as well, right before we jumped into our bio break. And again, thank you guys for doing that. Is that with the negotiation, I can tell you that there is always money on the table. Most people, if they can, they will try to get an employee for less than what their budget is. Mainly because that's just good business. I know that for some of you that may come across as like cheating, lying, or fill in the blank. But from a business standpoint, it's always best to offer a lower offer to see if they can get them to accept that, mainly because then it helps with their bottom line. So that's why there is always money on the table. Rob will tell you in his salary negotiation talk later this week that like at Notch 8, for example, they always talk about a range prior to going into a negotiation so they know where their bottom number is and where they can go up to. And typically they will offer right at the bottom and see if the person asks. He has a really great story about Leanne. So if he forgets to talk about Leanne, please ask him about Leanne because the story is really, really funny because she like refused to negotiate with him, even though she's one of our alumni and she had sat through the negotiation talk with him. And he was like, well, Leanne, like, is there anything you wanted to talk about? And she was like, nope, I just want the job. And he's like, are you sure there's nothing you want to talk about? So he tells the story a lot better than I do. So make sure to ask him for that story because it's really great. But yeah, like for example, I helped someone get an additional $10,000 just last week to their base pay. Now, the other important thing to know about earning potential is that this is the average base pay. So this is your take home prior to taxes. So also consider those types of things when you're going into to a potential employment opportunity. What this is not showing though is total compensation. So what I mean by total compensation, and you're actually seeing those numbers right below that average base number. So the additional cash compensation, the additional cash compensation is actually referring mostly to like bonuses. So this can be sign-on bonuses that do occur. This can also sometimes be bonuses at the end of the year. Some tech companies do profit sharing, which is a really awesome thing, which depending on where they're at the end of the year in the amount of profits they've gotten, they will then share a percentage of those profits across their entire company. My brother-in-law, who is in like a biotech company back home, they have practiced profit sharing. He's been there now like 10 years. And they make a ton of money because they make a lot of chemicals that mostly go to universities, to laboratories. So they always have clients, which is great. But his profit sharing check is anywhere from $50,000 a year to about $65,000 a year. And that's on top of his average base pay salary, which is around 95. So he sees almost half of his salary as a profit share in addition to his compensation. So there are some additional cash compensations that do happen within the tech industry as well. In addition to total cash compensation, it's also important to talk about, additional cash compensation, it's important to talk about total compensation as well. Total compensation includes your benefits package, which typically includes medical, dental, and vision. Those packages in particular range anywhere from $6,000 all the way up to $12,000, depending on what insurance the company has. And so that is what the company is paying for, rather than the contribution that you are making for. A lot of companies for your benefits do require some sort of like contribution from you as an employee, but then your contribution is subsidized by the employer's contribution. If you're lucky and work for the public sector, like at a community college or something like that, a lot of community colleges will actually completely cover as an employee all of yours. So for example, like my wife teaches at Grossmont College, and so her insurance is completely, we don't have any sort of contribution. So her benefits package is around $16,000, because we don't have an out-of-pocket expense when it comes to paying for that insurance. We just have to deal with co-pays, if that makes sense. So that's another thing to consider when you're looking at your total compensation, is your benefits package. In addition to that, you have things like 401k, retirement plans, as well as getting shares. Those are all things that Rob is going to talk about in his talk more specifically, but it's important that you're looking at overall total compensation. So for example, we had, I like that Andy said he's switching to biotech. So what's interesting is we had an alumni, he had never had like a professional 9-to-5 type job, and he actually got hired as a technical support engineer at ServiceNow. And when he originally got that offer, his base pay salary was about $68,000 a year. Which is actually pretty high for a technical support engineer. And his concern was that it wasn't enough. And so we talked about how to kind of go through the negotiation with that. We ended up being able to negotiate a salary of about a base pay salary of about $72,000. He was then also given a signing bonus of $22,000, or sorry, $22,000 for the year. He then was given another 401k match, as well as his benefits. And so when we did out the total compensation for him, his total compensation directly out of boot camp was over 6 figures. So that's another way to look at your total compensation. When we give you our average salaries, we are giving you our average base pay salaries, because typically that's what people are interested in. But it's really important that you do also focus in on that total compensation during a job offer, because oftentimes you're being compensated way over what your base pay is, and that can be challenging for some people to kind of wrap their head around, because it's not like direct dollars, if that makes sense. But that's something to consider as well. This came out by Hired, and this again is looking at the 2019 numbers. What I think is interesting about this is that these are the 2019 average tech worker salaries based off of location. So we can see here that the San Francisco Bay Area has the highest average tech worker salary at $145,000 a year. San Diego is pretty high up there. It increased by about 5%. And again, this is taking all tech worker salaries into consideration, not just web developers. And so San Diego, you can see, kind of hovers a little below the US average, and also a little below the global average as well. But it's important to recognize too, cost of living. So the interesting thing about this study is they actually took that into consideration. So when we look at the adjusted average tech worker salary that's adjusted for cost of living in San Francisco, so if we go back to the previous slide and see San Francisco is clearly the highest, not only across the United States, but also through London and Paris. We see that when we do an adjusted income for cost of living, San Diego jumps from $113,000 a year to $166,000 a year, meaning that you get more bang for your buck for what you're earning here in San Diego than if you were in San Francisco. And again, the main factors that affect the cost of living in a city include things like rent, real estate, utilities, groceries, local taxes, and transportation. So what I liked about this study is that it really showcases that San Diego is actually very much on par nationally with everywhere else, especially when we make that adjusted average salary based off of cost of living in San Francisco. And that's why San Francisco has a much higher average. I had a friend who worked at Facebook, and his initial offer at Facebook was $200,000 a year as a web developer, which sounds crazy. He was able to grow that to about $275,000 a year by the time that he was done. He now works at Twitter. But what was interesting is he could not afford to live in San Francisco off of a $200,000 salary. So although the average salary is super high, it's important to know that cost of living tends to drive some of those salary prices as well. What we want to avoid here in San Diego is definitely a growing tech hub scene. There's also some traction of San Diego becoming the center or the hub for data science in the United States. There's a big push to do that. We have one of 5 master's programs for data science at UCSD that's highly competitive, and so part of that is driving that way as well. But the important thing that we want to avoid is the same tech bubble that happened in San Francisco. So as San Francisco Bay Area started to increase the amount of tech companies that were in the Silicon Valley, the challenge with that was that it drove housing costs through the roof and actually created this really horrible bubble that the only way to survive was to be working a high-paying tech job, and those were people that were barely scraping by. So what we want to avoid here in San Diego is the same effect, because if San Diego grows to the point of being a tech giant, just like San Francisco, we have the possibility of pushing a lot of people out of San Diego, as just like a lot of people have been pushed out of San Francisco as well, and make the cost of living of San Diego 10 times higher. So the interesting thing about this in particular, I think, is taking into consideration all those cost of living factors as well. So Richie, go for it. We're not hearing your audio, Richie.
Hello?
Oh, now we gotcha.
Okay. Wait, can you go back 2 slides?
Yep.
Okay, I remember my question now. Is it common to like negotiate on the 401k match?
Mhm.
Like, oh, okay.
That's something that is definitely a possibility. I will tell you that the 401k match is typically standardized across the company. And so that is technically something that you can talk about. And I would always, during a negotiation, ask that as a question and say,
Okay.
is the match for 401k negotiable, or is that something that's standardized across the company? That way you're not like being like, ooh, I have this like secret hidden thing that I can ask for if they don't give me more money, because you don't want to ask for it and they're like, well, no, we don't do that either. That way you can kind of know and strategize of how you would move forward with a negotiation. But that's a good question to ask during the process as well.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right. So looking closer at home, San Diego and Carlsbad, the net tech employment, this was again at the top of 2019, and the numbers for 2020 should hopefully be coming out soon. But the net tech employment in San Diego and Carlsbad was about $168,000 individuals. And so our net tech employment rank across the country was, we were ranked at 17. And the net tech jobs added over 2018, we were ranked 21. That has since increased to, we are now number 17 for net tech jobs added. And for net tech employment, we've jumped up to the ranking of 13, which is really great as well. We can see the overall average wages for the tech industry here in San Diego. So the overall average wage in San Diego is roughly $59,000, and the average tech industry wage is about $123,000. So the growth potential in the tech industry in San Diego is really, really great. And you can also see the leading tech occupation jobs as well, with software and web developers being the leading tech occupation here in San Diego at around 21,000 different positions. And you can kind of see some of the other jobs out there as well, but software and web developers is definitely kind of the high point, if that makes sense. This tree structure is from the 2016 data that I was sharing with you guys. And this just helps to showcase the amount of the deficit that there was. So like you can see at the top here for software engineer back in 2016, the job postings for software engineer was just under 1 million. Active candidates for software engineer was 62,000. So there was a job deficit of about almost 900,000 positions. With this happening, what we've started to see and the trend that we've started to see moving forward is that this has made companies really start to evaluate how they are hiring a little bit differently. So you guys will be entering the job market in Q2, right kind of at the end of Q2, because you guys will finish your internship at the end of May. And Q3 will start June 1st. Or sorry, Q3 will start July 1st. Q2 will end in June. So you'll be right at the end of Q2. We have found that Q2 and Q3 for the year, and Q stands for quarter, that tends to be the highest job postings for junior and entry-level devs throughout the year is during Q2 and Q3. Part of the reason that we've started to see this trend is typically what happens with a company. Most companies are on a fiscal calendar of January to December. And so during Q1, they're wrapping up their finances from the previous year. They're seeing how much profit or how much deficit they have, and then taking that number and deciding where they need to be from a hiring standpoint for the rest of the year. A lot of companies during Q1 will tend to focus on hiring senior-based positions. Now, this does not mean that there are not junior entry-level positions during Q1 or even during Q4. It just means where there are the most junior and entry-level positions. So a lot of companies tend to hire the most seniors during Q1 in order to ramp them up to then build out their teams during Q2 and Q3. And the seniors are the ones who tend to hire mid-level and junior and entry-level devs. So that's why you're seeing a much higher job posting rate for both Q2 and Q3. Q4 tends to just have the least amount of job postings, mainly because of November and December with the giant holiday seasons. However, I will tell you that there are a lot of people that get hired during that period because oftentimes people don't want to quote unquote switch jobs during that period. So oftentimes it's new talent entering the market that tends to get hired during that period because they are not competing against people who are transitioning positions. So something to consider as well. But Q2 and Q3 tends to be really, really great, especially the end of Q3. I always like to think of it this way. There's a lot of tech companies out there that will run a summer internship program in the attempt of hiring those people on full time starting in the fall. And so that's why we tend to see a lot of those junior entry-level positions also hired during Q3 as well. So those are kind of the hiring trends moving forward. Does anyone have any questions about hiring trends before? Great. Cruz, go for it.
Yeah, I was just wondering, when we were doing our elevator pitches, like you suggested that we say like, oh, I'm a new full stack web developer here in San Diego. Should we append that and say that we are also like software engineers as like an extra thing to put under there, since like, people don't necessarily associate those to be the same when you're talking to them?
That's a great question. So it kind of just depends on how you want to brand yourself, which we'll talk a little bit about later today, I believe is when I moved that to. Anyway, so my answer to that would be that it's okay to kind of use those interchangeably. Sometimes people say like, you know, I'm a new software engineer to San Diego is a different way of phrasing it as well. Or just like a web developer, because that kind of is all inclusive. So you can definitely use both, but I would try to always start with one versus being like, I'm a web developer software engineer kind of a thing. Always kind of target the potential job that you're looking for. So for example, if you're applying for a position that's for a software engineer position on your resume, if you were to have, say, a summary statement, I would definitely focus that summary statement on saying something along the lines of, you know, I'm a new software engineer to San Diego because you're applying for a software engineer position. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, totally. That makes sense.
Cool. Austin, go ahead.
So you were saying Q2 and Q3 are good for junior devs. Then let's say if, a little bit later in our careers, and we move up, let's say it's senior dev or anything in the middle, like what would be a better time during the year to look for a job for those kind of positions?
That's a great question. We tend to see a lot of seniors being hired at the beginning and the end of the year, but this is what I will tell you about seniors and mid-level. Seniors and mid-level will always have the most job postings, no matter what,
Okay.
particularly mid-level. The reason being is because a lot of companies, kind of what we were talking about yesterday, they struggle a little bit in defining what a junior versus a senior versus a mid-level is, which is a big challenge for most companies. So you will tend to see mid-level type positions, AKA positions that don't have junior entry level in front of them all the time throughout the year.
Okay.
That's probably the group that is hired the most. Seniors are the most difficult to hire because seniors, again, it's so hard to define what a senior is. So oftentimes companies will settle for a mid-level developer in a senior role. And those, again, are kind of consistent throughout the year. You'll also start to notice that for mid-level positions and senior positions, you will be contacted all the time by recruiters for those positions because recruiters are constantly hiring for those positions.
Okay.
Really, although we see a lot for seniors at the beginning and the end of the year, for both mid-level and seniors, it's kind of just constant. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Rudy, go ahead.
So I think our graduation timeline's obviously pairing really well with a potential summer internship position. Can you speak a little bit more about the pros and cons of a summer internship? And is that something we should potentially really consider? Because I can imagine if you are interning at a company for a couple months and then they potentially do offer you a position that could be really, really great, and you've kind of really tested the waters at the org and they can really maybe potentially give you a really good deal, or are you kind of pigeonholing yourself? So kind of a little bit about pros and cons of that. And then maybe, I don't know if later in your presentation, you're going to talk about why would a company want to take a risk or invest in a junior dev?
Sure. So I would say, especially because you guys will be finishing your internships, there will be a lot of summer internships that will start their process late April, early May. And I always say, especially if it's a paid internship in particular, is a really great foot in the door. So a lot of our students have taken advantage of additional internships after the internship through Learn, because that's kind of been a direct hire situation moving forward, which is great. And because you already have some experience as a dev in the internship that you do through Learn, they're more likely to target you as a potential candidate for an internship because you have internship experience as well, which is great. So I always say, yes, if the opportunity presents itself, it's something to definitely go after. Your other question, Rudy, why do people take a risk on a junior dev? It's a really great, difficult question to answer. I actually think that it is more productive to invest time training a junior entry-level dev than to struggle in hiring a senior or mid-level position. And that's actually part of what Learn, that's like one of our new programs that we're working on, is how to support companies in leveling up junior entry-level devs to mid-level super quick. So someone, who's been out on the job for a year, a company can invest time in someone like that, like a candidate like that, to get them up to that 3 to 5 year mark really quickly through some additional training. The challenge is with a junior entry level dev, just like any position, you're taking a giant risk in cost to the company based off of where the skills are at. So that's why as a junior entry level dev, you'll continue to hear me push for, the willingness to learn, the willingness to improve are all important to talk about as a candidate. But in addition to that, you also want to make sure that your conversations are, I really feel like these are my skill sets that are going to add value to your company. it's the changing the conversation for a company is really important to say, I'm going to show you that I can come in and show true value, and I may start at a lower salary, but maybe we can negotiate that salary in 6 months once I've shown a proven track record of that I'm really adding value to your company. So that's actually a conversation I had with one of our recent alumni, is to say, like, from a negotiation tactic standpoint, you can take a lower salary offering and say, I'd like to revisit the salary, in 6 months. And over those 6 months, I really want to prove to you that I'm contributing a lot of value to this company. There's a lot of other research out there that shows productivity levels of new employees, especially junior entry-level devs in particular, because they are so new to the industry. They don't reach full productivity until the 6th month that they are in a new position. So the faster that you can get up to full productivity, the better. And that tends to take a lot of additional work. So although I'm not saying that everyone needs to do this, those who are willing to put in a lot of hard work at the get-go, you will see that you will level up a lot quicker as a developer because you've put in that time initially. So for example, that could include like additional hours outside of work where you're putting in like study time and stuff like that, coming in the next day and saying, I ran into this error, but I went home, I figured out the error, and now I'm here. That's going to show a lot of value to a company. And if you push really hard, especially those first 3 to 6 months, and if you can get up to full productivity within 3 months, the company's going to be super impressed with you. And that's going to also help in your future with that company or leveraging another offer as well. Does that kind of make sense? So it's a hard question to answer about why companies take a risk with a junior. The big thing is that they need to do that in order to continue to build and grow their company. If all they're doing is hiring seniors, they're going to get into really big trouble because seniors come with a large price tag. And oftentimes a really big ego, which can sometimes have more detriment to a company because you're investing all this time and energy and money into a senior who might derail your entire project. So there's actually sometimes a higher risk in bringing on a senior than there is a junior entry-level dev.
Thanks.
Yeah. Jonas, go ahead.
If you choose to go the freelance route.
Jonas, could you repeat your
Yeah, the numbers that you showed, do they take into consideration if you choose to go the freelance route?
Great question. So these numbers do not include the freelancer. So these are just full-time positions. If you decide to go the freelance route, that's a great question. You tend to have a contract rate. And one thing that I expressed to someone else recently is that your contract rate will always be higher than what your typical hourly rate is for a full-time position. So your hourly rate for a full-time position may start as low as $20 to $25 an hour, sometimes as low as $15 an hour, closer to minimum wage. But as you get higher and higher up into like the contract work that you're doing, your contract work will probably be anywhere from like $30 to $35 an hour. So you do have the ability to make more money as a contractor, but you also have to take into consideration the reason that rates are higher as a contractor is because you then have to turn around and pay taxes because taxes are not being taken out of your contract rate. With AB5, if anyone's familiar with AB5 here in California, as of right now, AB5 is not affecting web developers and software engineer contractors because of the category that they fall under as of like a knowledge expert. And so software engineers and web developers can still be contract employees. The challenging thing with that, though, as a contractor and why you should set your rate higher is because you have to take into consideration that no taxes are being taken out of that rate. And at the end of the year, you're going to have a giant tax bill unless you're paying quarterly taxes. So that's part of the reason that the numbers that I'm showing here are just for full-time positions. But if you do go that freelance route, you're typically looking at a little bit of a higher hourly rate than you would be if you took a full-time salary and broke it down by hours. If you guys ever want to do that, you can take an average salary and divide it by the number 2080. That's how many hours there are in a full-time position for a given year. So that's how to get your hourly rate, is to take your base pay and divide it by that number. All right. Heya, go for it. Oop, hold on, Heya. I'm trying to unmute you.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't know if you have answers to this, but do you have any knowledge in the outlook of what the job market will be because due to like recent climate?
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about that. That's a great question. So as of right now, all of the numbers that are coming from the US Department of Labor, for example, in February of this year, we did not see any sort of downturn in the economic market. The numbers for March will be a little bit more telling, but won't necessarily tell us exactly what we need to know. And that's because it's really hard to utilize data that's only 30 days old versus a longer collection of data. So really, and I know this is not the answer that necessarily everybody wants to hear, but we won't really know how COVID-19 will affect the overall job market and economy probably until the end of Q3, which is unfortunate because you guys will be in your job search during that time. What we are seeing though is we are seeing that for the tech industry. I've continued to see new job postings every single day. What that is telling me is that people are still actively recruiting positions. The only thing that's going to change for the tech industry, most likely, is you're going to see the following. One, early, smaller startups are probably going to have a less likelihood of hiring, mainly because small businesses will be the most affected during this economic downturn. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not necessarily going to be hiring out contractors. It actually may be more cost effective for them to hire contractors at this point. So contract work may continue to go up for those small businesses and startups. But I would say that most startups and small businesses, you're going to see a decrease in hiring for those companies in particular. For mid-level to larger companies, I don't see any slowdown happening at all. However, because their entire staffs are going remote, you will see hiring processes that take longer. So an average hiring process, for example, can honestly, I know this is a giant range, can take anywhere from a few weeks to a few months at this point. And it really just depends on the company as well as the bandwidth that the company has for time and effort that they can put into a certain position that they're hiring for. For larger companies, you're tending to see a shorter duration of hiring process. But I say that knowing that like Thermo Fisher, for example, if you were to ever interview through them, they have a 12-step hiring process that can take anywhere from 2 months to 3 months just to get hired. We had a student who went through that whole process and they got to final round interviews and didn't get the job. So imagine going through 3 months worth of interviews at a company and still not getting the position. So some of those companies do just have a long process anyway. But I would say that with COVID-19, you can expect slightly longer hiring processes from all companies. That's because mostly they're trying to figure out how to do it. So they know that they still need to hire these people. They just need to figure out, can we do virtual interviews? How do we run those? Do we feel comfortable with them not coming on site? Do we want to meet them in person, answering those questions? So that's really where we're going to see the hiring market start to slow down, is not necessarily in positions being put out and available, but I would say that the process is probably going to slow down. And that's what I'm seeing right now happening. More than anything else. Response rates will probably also take longer, if that makes sense. And we'll talk a little bit about like strategy for response rates a little later today as well. Does that answer your question, Heya?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Awesome. Great. Any other questions before we move on to the next section? Are you guys getting a lag in, sorry, I'm just looking at the group chat. Are you guys getting a lag in audio from me?
Not anymore.
Not anymore, but you were. Okay.
Yeah, no. Just for like a
Occasionally
minute.
There's like a stutter. Yeah.
I'm still getting the lag.
Whenever your connection shows as red, it slows down. Which has been kind of often.
It's been often, you're saying? Okay. Well, I'll take a look at that during lunch to kind of adjust. I just want to look at our schedule really quickly because we are falling behind, which is okay. And mainly, I think it's because we were taking some additional time this morning to get things kicked off. So when we return from lunch today is when we'll start the overview of resumes before we go into the resume work session. But I would like to finish out kind of talking a little bit about job boards and job titles and stuff like that. That'll bring us all the way probably to about 11:55, and then we'll be taking our lunch break. Cool. So these are job profiles in your Google Drive. I have an entire list of these job profiles with paragraphs of their descriptions under them, mainly because there's so many different types of job profiles that our alumni are currently experiencing or are in positions for. And so this could literally take like 2 hours to go through every single one of these job profiles. So to help with that, we've created a job profile sheet that has all of these with descriptions under them of kind of what they entail. But we'll talk about them very briefly now. So when you're looking for job positions, when you're job searching, my big thing is I always like to tell people to make sure to diversify how you are searching for jobs. Not only does that mean looking at different job boards, which we'll cover in just a second, but that also means being creative about the types of job titles you're looking for. The biggest headache, I would say, for the tech industry in particular is that we are that there is no standardization across the industry of what a job profile or job title means. So you may see something like software engineer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at a company like Intuit, which is a slightly larger tech company, and they have very specific reasons of why there are different levels of software engineer. And then you may have a company that calls themselves a web developer, but is mostly doing back-end development, a web developer that's mostly doing front-end web development, and stuff like that. So it's important that you're really diversifying how you're searching for jobs. Because of the keyword searches on job boards, you'll tend to get more job opportunities by diversifying the job profiles you're looking for. So the big one I always say is search for web developer, search for software engineer, search for full stack web developer. You'll tend to get a bunch of different types of job postings. The other thing that I tend to tell people is you can try to search like junior web developer or entry-level web developer. I will tell you that all of a sudden it'll return like 5 things for you and you'll freak out and be like, oh my God, there's only 5 jobs on the whole market for entry level or junior dev. The reason being is because more and more profiles are getting away from using titles like junior, entry level, and instead they're just treating them as web developers. And where you'll look for is the experience section to see what level of developer that is. We've had a few alumni actually recently that have applied for web developer positions that are just web developer, and then going through the initial interview process have very quickly realized that what they're hiring for is a senior developer, and they're just not titling it that way. One of the reasons that people tend to do that is because if they can get a mid-level, if they can get a senior developer under a web developer job profile and pay them less, they're totally going to do that. So sometimes you also deal with that as well, which can be tricky. So with that being said, the developer track is kind of your typical track. A web developer and a full stack web developer, you're going to tend to see a lot more front end focused developer positions that are labeled as full stack web developer and web developer. And then back end developer, although there are definitely job postings out there for that, I would say that out of all the developer roles, that is the one that you will see the least from a job profile standpoint. There's also applications developer as well as mobile mobile developer that kind of fall under that as well. And most developers are really just focusing in on code. So if I were to differentiate a developer from a software engineer, most developer roles will mostly be 100% coding based, whereas software engineer positions may include other job duties as well. But software engineer, web developer, oftentimes, as I've been saying, is interchangeable. Now, the other position that is really important is in the second column. You'll see the second bullet point, the QA engineer. QA stands for quality assurance, and so there are roles out there that are specifically designed to make sure that your code is really good. Now, there's a difference. Each company is going to have a different theory on what a QA engineer is. So for a lot of companies, a QA engineer is an entry-level position to join the dev team, and that you'll be in that QA engineer role for maybe 6 months to 12 months, maybe even all the way up to 18 months prior to moving on to being promoted onto the dev team. The reason that they do this, which is a smart idea, is that it allows for new employees, particularly entry-level employees or junior employees, to actually get introduced to their code base and learn their code base before they just jump in and start coding within that code base. So that's where that comes from a lot. The other position that you'll see out there that has the same trajectory is called a technical support engineer. Oftentimes those positions at companies are initial positions that you can apply for that will get you onto the dev team. My big caveat with these two positions is it is critical that during the the hiring process, that you ask those questions. As the QA engineer, is this a feeder position to go on to the dev team? Is there ability to move on to the engineer team from here? Or are you really looking for a career QA or a career technical support engineer? Because some companies really do have that career mentality. One of our internship partners, previous internship partners called Portfolium, they have a very specific idea behind a QA engineer. And they do that job search completely separately because they really feel that a QA engineer thinks very differently than a software engineer. And a QA engineer needs to be a lot more detail oriented because they are the ones who are making sure that the code is working. They also have to have really good people skills because they have to go to other developers and say, hey, your code is wrong or it's not working and you need to fix it. So there's a lot of communication that's required for a QA engineer, as well as kind of those interpersonal skills as well. So sometimes companies really do treat QA engineers as a completely separate career. So that's something to consider as well. You'll then have like the content strategist and SEO strategist. Those are kind of more on the like running behind the scenes, website traffic, all of that kind of stuff. I've also seen like digital media strategist or digital media content developer, something like that. These are people who have marketing backgrounds, need to know a little bit of HTML and CSS and maybe a little bit of JavaScript, but are mostly doing like the forward marketing side of what some tech companies are doing. You then also have positions like the Scrum Master or Project Manager. These are positions that really require a lot of leadership skills, a lot of people management in particular, but also require a lot of like understanding of business practice and budgeting. And so these positions can sometimes be a really great intermediary to be working as a part of the dev team, but not necessarily coding on a regular basis. Some Scrum Masters do code in addition to being kind of the master of the Scrum, and basically they are helping to manage the dev teams. This can also be considered someone like a technical lead. So technical lead is another position that we see oftentimes that our students move into prior to becoming a senior. So you can basically move up, and once you're able to be a technical lead, that means that you're the lead on a project, but you're not necessarily at the level of a senior. You're just helping to not only manage, like to actually code on the project, but you're helping to manage the project as well. And we tend to see that in companies that have less project management set up, are those technical leads. There's also the DevOps position. The DevOps is Hold on, it's showing. Okay, I think I'm back now. So the DevOps position is an intermediary between the development team and the operations. Jez, who works at Notch 8, is a really amazing DevOps person. DevOps, if it's something that you might be interested in, is one of the hardest positions to hire for a company, because it's really finding someone with a particular set of skills that understands the dev environment, can also code and function within the dev environment, but really also has a background in operations and how things work. A lot of stuff that goes into being a DevOps is style guide creation, making sure that there is consistency with code across the company as well, and also making sure that they organize with, say, like a QA engineer of the process of how code is deployed and stuff like that. So that position is a really interesting position between being a developer and an operations specialist. Then you have stuff like data scientist and data engineer. We do have a few alumni that have fallen into that. Typically, those positions do require some additional higher education of some kind. And as of right now, there are a few data boot camps out there, like data science boot camps, but that's really just going to give you an introduction. Right now, those positions are typically being hired with people with master's degrees. But that doesn't, for data scientist. From a data engineer standpoint, it's engineers who really understand the back end pretty well and have some understanding of data science that are getting those data engineer positions. And so that's another trajectory that a lot of our students have taken as well. There's stuff like product manager, which is they are the individuals who are in charge of the product, whether that's a software or whether it's a service that's provided. And so those people tend to be really creative, but also super organized and tend to manage the product that they're focusing on as a company. And then you have the design suite. So web designer, UI designer, UX designer. You'll also see UI and UX developer as well. If it has developer versus designer, there will be the expectation that as a UI developer or UX developer that you are coding regularly. So that's something to consider. Versus the design side, which is mostly going to be focused in on that design process. And that kind of, we've also had a lot of alumni that, can you guys still hear me now?
Yeah.
Am I still cutting in and out a lot?
From time.
You're fine with me.
Okay.
Maybe every 10 minutes.
Okay. I'm gonna, I'll look at how my internet is doing. Okay. So, and then some of our alumni have also gone on to be like graphic designers and stuff like that as well, more on the design side of things as well. So again, in your Google Drive, there's a really great resource for all of you that talks a little bit about each of these job profiles a little bit more in depth than what I just shared. And that can be found in your Google Drive with all of the other materials. Now, the other thing to cover too is job boards. So job boards, this is kind of where to go out and find the jobs. The biggest ones being LinkedIn, Indeed, and Glassdoor. So Indeed, just so that you know how all of these function, Indeed functions from the context of when companies post, they can post for free for 7 days, but then it moves to a paid model. If the company chooses not to do a pay model for their job postings, their job posting then gets buried. So a neat trick for utilizing Indeed is to look at the first, like if you type in web developer, look at the first like 5 pages for positions, and then jump to like the last page, say like page 75, and work backwards, because all of those jobs are basically like smaller startups that can't afford to go to a paid model, but their job posting has gotten buried after a week. So that's kind of a strategy for Indeed. LinkedIn and Glassdoor both require payment in order to post a position there, so you know that the company is investing time by posting there, and it's not cheap. I think for Glassdoor, it's about $395 per position for 30 days. And for LinkedIn, it's about $475 for a single position for 30 days. And so the LinkedIn has also recently moved to a pay-per-click model as well, which can actually be a lot more expensive for a company, but it does provide more companies to access LinkedIn as a resource. So you'll find a lot of job postings on LinkedIn, Glassdoor, and Indeed. Some additional ones to look at include Dice. So Dice is a really great one. That's more of a national job board. AngelList is really, really great. So AngelList is going to be more of your startups and smaller companies post on AngelList a lot. We have a lot of students who have gotten jobs off of AngelList, which is really great. Stack Overflow, TechCrunch, they also have job boards that are available. And then Vettery is more for contract work. There's also a really great job board called Upwork, UPWORK. Upwork is a really great place to go for contract work. That's something you could even start doing now, to kind of like, you can create a profile in Upwork, you can bid on certain projects, and they range anywhere from someone saying, hey, I'm a startup CEO. I need someone to build a website for me and I've got $800 to pay someone. Will someone do it? So stuff like that, all the way to contract to hire positions. So people say, we're looking to hire someone full time, but we'd like to start this person on like a 3-month trial run contract. So Upwork is a really great place to also look for positions. And then lastly, Slack is a really great place to look as well. So for San Diego specific job boards, there's san diego techscene.org. They have a job board. It's not super updated pretty frequently, but is something that is definitely good to check out. Fresh Brewed Tech is a monthly newsletter that is sent out that kind of has like the happenings of tech here in San Diego. And they have a job posting section as well. What I love about Fresh Brewed Tech, and here's another like sneaky secret, is once every quarter, they will send out every company that has either gotten a acquisition or has gotten funding in the last quarter. Now, if you see a company that has recently got funding, especially if the funding is over $1 million, I can guarantee you that part of that funding cycle is to hire people. So if you're seeing a company that has either been recently acquired or has recently been bought or has recently gotten some sort of funding, that's a great company to research and reach out to now prior to them actually posting positions. So you can start a relationship with them as well. So that's kind of like a sneaky way of how to like navigate like which companies are going to be hiring next and how can I start to get on their radar before they start posting positions. That's a great way to do that. And luckily, Fresh Brewed Tech newsletter does that for us every single quarter, which is really great. Startup San Diego is another really great place to look for startups as well. And what I'll do is share in our Slack channel, there are 3 Slack channels that I highly encourage that you guys all join. Part of the reason that I encourage that you guys join this, and if I can pull up my Slack real quickly, is this is San Diego Startup Slack channel. And what I love about being a member of these Slack channels is, one, there's an introduction section that allows for you to go in, introduce yourself to the channel. You can say I'm a new developer to San Diego and I'm looking to meet with people, those types of things as well. But then each of these channels also has either what's called a talent or a jobs channel. And this is where people post for potential jobs. And what I love about this is if you see a potential job, so this is for a freelance senior developer with Swift knowledge. So maybe it's not something that is right for you, but you research the company Mammals and you're like, oh my God, I love that company. I really want to work for them. You now have a direct way of messaging that person through Slack. So it's a really great way to build out some of those relationships as well as looking for jobs that aren't necessarily posted on job boards. So that's why Slack is really great as well. And I will post in your Slack channel the 3 that we recommend, which is San Diego Startups, San Diego Tech Hub, and then San Diego JavaScript. Are there any questions about job boards or anything like that before we take our lunch break?
I just was wondering, I just saw on the Slack channel, the talent thing that you were just showing us, how he said like rate is market value? Like, what does that mean?
Sure. So when someone says rate is market value, that means that you would look at the average, and you can do that on Glassdoor. So you can go to Glassdoor and look up the average salary for a mid-level web developer in San Diego. So that's what they're talking about when they say market.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So market rate for like a mid-level, or maybe if it's market rate for a senior, like a market rate for a senior is going to be probably anywhere from $100,000 to $125,000 a year. Market rate for a mid-level is probably going to be closer to like 75 all the way up to 95 is what I would consider market rate. So that's what they mean by market rate, is like we are competitive with the market, versus like a smaller startup, which may say, well, we're like in our early stages, and so we can really only pay you like $40,000 a year to start, but like once we get our funding cycle, we'll be able to increase everyone's salary and stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Rudy.
So outside of like the big three, like LinkedIn, Indeed, and Glassdoor, would you say AngelList was like the most productive outside of those?
AngelList is really great.
Cool. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Cool. So we're going to take our lunch now. I'm going to post, so we'll come back from lunch right at 1 o'clock, and we'll go into talking a little bit about resumes. And then after that, we'll jump into our work session for resume building. The way that resume building will function is as you guys are going through, if you guys message me through the chat, I will pull you and I into a breakout room so that we can chat individually and not chat on the full channel. So if you've raised, and I would recommend that we start that process by raising your hand. That way I can bring you into that separate breakout room. This is the first time we're going to try breakout rooms. So obviously if we can take a little grace and patience to make sure that they work. I tested it a little bit last night and it should be fine, but I just want to make sure that we kind of have patience. But that's kind of the process of moving forward. So we'll see you guys all at 1 o'clock, and I'll post the next link in your Slack channel, probably close to 12:45. I will see you all then.